Good to go, Karla.
Good morning. Thank you for your patience with us this morning. Not surprisingly for the past year we had some technical difficulties this morning, but we're so glad that you chose to be with us this morning. And we are going to talk about how we can unlock the potential of college and high school programs for students with disabilities. That's me. I'm Karla Phillips-Krivickas. I'm a senior advisor at KnowledgeWorks and also the CEO of Think Inclusion, where we work with public and private sector leaders to ensure students with disabilities are included in all programs, policies, and initiatives.
My name is John Alfuth, and I am our Director of State Policy at KnowledgeWorks, where we work to help states and schools and districts think about how to provide more student-centered learning. We are also steering team members of the College and High School Alliance.
So I know we got a late start, but if you're out there, can you put in the chat your name, what state you're in, and what your role is?
So it looks like we're experiencing some issues with the chat right now, so we'll go ahead and move forward.
Okay.
And I'll just share those out later as they come in.
All right, John, you want to walk us through today's agenda?
Absolutely. So what we're going to do is just provide a brief introductory overview of the College and High School Alliance, this tool that we've created called Unlocking Potential, and then how we propose to use it. We realize that some of the folks on the call may be familiar with the College and High School Alliance and the work that we've done around unlocking potential, but for those who may not be familiar, we just want to make sure that we give a brief overview so that everyone kind of understands the background before we get into the wonderful tool that Karla has worked with the Alliance to create. So on the next slide, you can see we're just going to talk briefly about who is the College and High School Alliance. And if you go to the next slide, just a brief overview. In 2015, we had a group of national organizations, which you can see on the next slide. There were 6 of us at the time, 7 now, that collaborated together to develop a shared agenda for reauthorizing the Every Student Succeeds Act. And the group was able to successfully insert 15 different provisions related to college and high school policy in 5 different ESSA titles. So we formally launched this alliance in 2017, and it serves as a coalition for supporting dual concurrent enrollment and early college high schools through both federal and state policy, as well as more recently Perkins 5 policy. We also, in 2019, adopted some principles for our goal in equity work to close gaps and ensure that high quality federal and state policy for college and high school programs is enacted. So in addition to the 7 steering team members, which you can see listed here, we have a large range of member organizations, both at the national and the state level, that support our work. So if you have any interest, you're on the call today about joining the College and High School Alliance as a member, please feel free to reach out at the conclusion of this. We can go to the next slide. So really quick, we want to make sure we define what we mean when we say college and high school programs. So we really use this term interchangeably to cover a lot of different programs that can cover a lot of different states. So unfortunately, there is no universal term that applies in every single situation. I was actually told once that I think there are, well, almost about 3 dozen different terms that can be used across the country in various locations to refer to these programs. We decided to just adopt the blanket term college and high school programs to encompass all of the different programs that rely on partnerships between K-12 and higher education, and that gives students an opportunity to earn transcripted and transferable college credit towards a degree. On the next slide, I won't read the whole thing, but you can see our North Star. The policy framework, again, really focuses on 3 things: access, participation, and success in college and high school programs. So moving forward, I want to take a little bit of time and talk briefly about this tool on the next slide called Unlocking Potential. This was a tool, and the next slide, you can see the cover page for it. So when you go and access it on our website, you know you're in the right place. That details strategies for how states can increase equitable access to college and high school programs. We published this late in 2019 in collaboration with the Level Up Coalition, and this also serves as a roadmap for states that wants to design policy that drive meaningful change, again, for access, equity, and quality for college and high school programs. On the next slide, we're just going to talk briefly about some of the reasons why we do this. I'm sure for a lot of folks on this call, this is kind of second nature information, but just as a brief overview, we know research has demonstrated that students who participate in these programs have better graduation rates, immediately enroll in college, and persist to completion at higher rates than their peers. But unfortunately, the reality is that while participation in programs like these have grown in the recent decade, that too many students still lack access to these programs. So on the left, the lighter the color gets, the lower the program participation is. And you can also see on the right that while we have a good, overall 8% participation rate, that there's a lot of differences between different racial groups. So there's also inequities that exist across different gender lines, as well as socioeconomic backgrounds. So later in this presentation, Karla is going to be highlighting some of the participation rates with students with disabilities, which we have fortunately been able to work with some folks at the Community College Research Center to dig into a bit more. On the next slide, just a couple of additional definitions. Again, I won't read through all of these here, but you can see we've also defined equity as well as policy. Again, very broad terms just to make sure that we're encompassing all the things that meet these different definitions. So what's actually in unlocking potential? On the next slide, you can see that we have 6 different categories that unlocking potential covers. These include equity goals and public reporting, program integrity and credit transfer, finance, course access and availability, instructor capacity, and navigational support. So again, because we started a little late, I don't want to go too much into all of these because we'll be doing that a bit later in the presentation as we dig into the tool that Karla has worked very hard on around students with disabilities. But if you go and check out the link at collegeandhighschoolalliance.com, there is a whole wealth of information that covers each of these topics, so you can dig a bit more into that. So in closing, 2 slides forward on unlocking potential, what we really hope that states will do is use this in 3 key ways. First, we want it to be used by policymakers to be able to assess the current state of policy for college and high school programs in their states across all 6 categories. Second, the document at the very end provides and throughout provides concrete recommendations and action steps that policymakers can take to really inform what policymakers can do once they've done that assessment. And then third, it provides a wide range of dozens of examples across all different states that have put some of these policies in place, and also includes links to references and relevant policy documents for states that are interested in additional information. So before we go on, so you're not having to listen to us just talk the whole time, we just want to pose a brief question for the audience. So it looks like the chat may be working, so let's test this out. So in the chat box, using a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very well aligned to this vision as we presented it, where would you guess your state is? 5 being we're right there, 1 being we've got some work to do, and everything in between. Well, it appears that we have a 30-second delay in the chat. So I think what we're going to do is go ahead and start typing in, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it off here to my colleague Karla, who is going to start digging into some background information on special education and then talking about how this overlaps with college and high school policy. But again, please go ahead and keep typing that information into the chat. Again, 5, we think that we've got a lot of these things figured out, 1 being we've got some work to do. So thank you very much. Karla, all you.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see their comments because we're usually harsher on our own states evaluating than others would be. Can you go ahead and move a slide? So you may have noticed in those earlier analyses in the tables that there was one group of students that was missing.
And we find that that's often the case, and it's our students with disabilities, which especially in K-12 represents on average about 13% nationally. But one of the things that I like to start with is what I call Special Education 101, which is who is in special education? Because we find often that there are a lot of myths. If you look really closely at this chart, and this is a national average, by the way, 3 categories comprise about 76, 77%. And if you look at their specific learning disabilities, which includes things like dyslexia, speech or language impairment, and other health impairments, which would cover things like ADD, ADHD. But what really should stand out to you if you've never seen this is intellectual disabilities is that small little green triangle that's only 6.45%. But it's been my experience that people who are unfamiliar with special education often assume that the lion's share of kids have some kind of cognitive or intellectual disability. But you can see really quickly from this chart that that is not the case, which also tells us the reverse, right? The reverse that most students with disabilities are capable of achieving on par with their peers if they receive the supports that they are entitled to. Oh, and you can see my little math there on the side. So it was about 70%, I was close. And again, there's the intellectual disability, 6.45%. This is the big one I want to think about for a second, 3.9%. Again, as John alluded to with our friends at the Community College Resource Center, we were able to present to you some data that we don't think has ever been seen before. And we did a pretty lengthy literature review for this project. And I could not find any college and high school program data nationally really disaggregated for students with disabilities. What that number represents is that students served under IDEA, which is the federal authorizing law for special education, make up about 12.7% of the school population, but only 3.9% of the students enrolled in dual enrollment. So you can see a really big gap. And you can see that gap in comparison with other subgroups. So what that 8.8% represents is the 12.7 that they represent nationally minus the 3.9. But you can see that that students with disabilities far exceed the gap for Black and Hispanic students and even English language learners. And this is the chart that I'm assuming may grab your attention. Let me squint really closely. There's North Carolina really closely in the middle. So if you see the US in the number, North Carolina is 3 to the left. But I don't want you to hurt your eyes too much, and just know that this chart is in the appendix of the report, which should be out, I believe, next week. But North Carolina is right there on par with the average. Of course, average is still a negative 8.8. So we were able to kind of create this new term. Students served under IDEA have been shut out of dual enrollment coursework at over 36% of schools nationally. And we are defining shut out, meaning that these are schools that have students with disabilities in them, and they offer dual enrollment coursework, but don't have any students with disabilities enrolled in any of their dual enrollment courses. So that's how we're defining shut out. And you can see that's a really big number. And again, we can find our state. So let's find North Carolina. There you go. Thank you for pointing that out with the cursor. So North Carolina is definitely better than the average. So there's a little something to be proud of. And again, this is also in the appendix of the report. So now we're going to go back to the framework that John laid out for you. This is from the original Unlocking Potential report. We took this same framework and just applied this lens to students with disabilities. And through that, we're able to come up with over 20 hard recommendations with plenty of state examples. And we're actually excited that we were able to find so many good state examples. John, you want to launch us the first one?
Yes, and I feel like Karla is being modest, and when she says we, I think it should really be Karla found a lot of great examples, because Karla has really done a lot of the really deep work on this. So we're going to do a quick kind of overview of each of the 6 areas, talk about what it is, why it matters, especially relating to students with disabilities, and then give a couple of state examples. So you can see equity goals and public reporting. The big picture piece is that states set an equitable statewide public goal for increasing participation and successful of traditionally underserved student groups in college and high school programs with clear disaggregated public reporting and accountability for progress towards the goal. This matters because being intentional about closing equity gaps, accurately measuring them, and being held publicly accountable to close the gaps is a fundamental piece of unlocking the promise of not only college and high school programs, but education in general. It's also important to have discussions and definitions of equity, which do often include students who've been historically disadvantaged or historically marginalized. However, oftentimes these students with disabilities are excluded from a lot of these definitions. So Karla, I'm gonna let you jump back in and talk about a couple of our example states that you were able to dig up on this area.
Thank you. Go ahead and forward the slide. Yeah. So we have quite a few in this section of the report. I just teased out a couple, but I want to say that in theory, this should have been the one area where every state had something. If for no reason, then ESSA requires this, but there were a few states that did. So Kentucky school report cards were a good example where they actually, one, have dual credit programs, but also disaggregated by subgroups and included students with disabilities. And I'm sad to say that this was a rare finding. Illinois' model partnership agreement that was authorized by their state board of ed has a provision in there discussing how the parties can ensure the exchange of data. And I'm looking at the backgrounds of some of our participants that are in the chat, and mainly higher ed. So you guys know that college and high school programs are, I always think of that Venn diagram, right, of high school and college, and it's that unique intersection. And that's when data becomes really critical, because in a lot of states, there's no natural connection of that data. There's a few states that have really robust P20 data systems, especially if their state board of education is over K-12 and higher ed, but that's rare, which means that most states need to really take that step to make the data connect. And of course, we always have FERPA concerns. So it's really a good model practice of Illinois to say in your MOUs for your programs with high schools, let's have a provision that actually discusses how we're going to exchange and share data. Not only so we can see the data of individual students and know what their needs are, but even be able to just determine numbers as a whole.
So moving on to the second piece of unlocking potential, focused on program integrity and credit transfer. This area focuses on making sure that states support and promote high quality college and high school programs through effective oversight and cross-sector collaboration between both K-12 and post-secondary sectors, as well as ensure that credit can be articulated from institution to institution. So this is really important because setting a goal to increase participation rates will amplify the needs of cooperation across sectors, especially for students with disabilities. And then again, for students with disabilities, it is very important to take care to ensure that the courses that students take will, again, just like every student, count for both high school and college credit. And Karla, I think you have some examples to share with us here as well.
I do, thank you. Go ahead. Florida. So Florida law requires that institutes of higher education offering dual enrollment to include in its articulation agreement the services and resources available to students with disabilities. This may seem like a no-brainer or even something really simple, but you'd be shocked at how rare this was for me to find. And this at least tells me that the state is thinking about students with disabilities. And this, when the state is telling the institutes in K-12, you got to discuss this in your MOUs, that sends a really clear message from the state that they are thinking about students with disabilities, expect students with disabilities to be enrolled in these programs, and that we need to consider that. Again, Pennsylvania's dual credit toolkit recommends, again, that MOUs determine these responsibilities. Again, a really powerful statement from the state that we are expecting students with disabilities to enroll, so we need to figure out how we're going to serve them.
Thanks, Karla. And moving on to the third area that we have in this 6-part unlocking potential framework, finance. And I should also mention, and I can actually really quick after I talk here, drop the link into the chat box. But in addition to unlocking potential, we have a whole separate report that we wrote just on state finance policy around dual credit. So that is also available on our website. And again, I'll drop it in the chat here. But this area really focuses on making sure that states are exploring funding mechanisms that can ameliorate the cost of additional supports and services to students with disabilities and that need to participate and excel in college and high school coursework. So this is a crucial piece of it, as gaps in access to college and high school programs for students with disabilities are never going to close while both real and sometimes perceived cost barriers remain, and providing additional supports is seen as an unfunded mandate. States do have an opportunity to push schools to leverage all of their existing funding resources and potentially develop new mechanisms that will create or strengthen the partnerships between school districts and institutions of higher education. Karla, back over to you for some examples.
Thank you. I wish I had more. This was one of the weak areas of the report, but Washington's example was pretty cool because they just had a dual credit equity grant, which I thought was a pretty unique idea. And the grant is intended to focus on student groups furthest from education justice, which includes students with disabilities. And it was almost like an innovation type grant. So they could use it to fund student data, student readiness, modifications. So I really like this idea. It's one of my personal favorites because I think it's going to inspire creativity and innovation. This is actually a rare federal spotlight. So in September 2019, after a lot of lobbying from some disability groups, the U.S. Department of Education under DeVos issued a Q&A document clarifying that federal funds, both IDA and VR, can be used for dual enrollment in if certain conditions are met. But this is a really critical document because, as you know, this is a significant pot of money for the K-12. And so being able to use those resources for dual enrollment is a very powerful tool. I'm sorry, can you go back 1 second, Mary? I didn't find any examples of this, but I just feel the need to say that this is a really simple thing that states can do. States can put out a state Q&A or FAQ document on how those dollars can be used. Again, seems like those things are not powerful, but they are, because they're sending a really strong signal from the state that said, hey, not only are we telling you this, but the feds are saying you can use these funds and here's how.
Great, thanks for that clarification, Karla. On to our fourth area, course access and availability. And this particular area focuses on ensuring, within the context of this report, that students with disabilities are able to access college and high school courses with the same pathways that maximize opportunities for all students to earn multiple college credits and facilitate the integration of college and high school programs into federally required transition plans. So this is important because ensuring equitable access includes making sure that courses are available to all students and ensuring that artificial barriers aren't put in place. In designing college and high school programs, states also do have to recognize that there are multiple pathways into post-secondary education and the workplace, and that these pathways must also be accessible to students with disabilities. Karla, back over to you.
Texas, this was a good one. They have an early college, a pretty robust early college program in statute that specifically targets students who are at risk of dropping out or want to accelerate graduation. So there are a lot of statutes that have that kind of vague language. But what's cool about it is the Texas Education Agency, which is their K-12 Department of Ed, released a blueprint that specifically said students with disabilities are historically represented and should be targeted in this program. So again, a really simple step, yet really powerful, where the state says, no, we expect that these students be included in this program. Again, guidance documents are great examples. Colorado had quite a few to support concurrent enrollment, noting their rights, but also defining that transition services for students 18 to 21. So there's a small percent of, I don't know the number, of students with disabilities who are in high school till 21. And really part of it is because they have more severe or moderate disabilities, but they also need transition services. And this is a whole breakout box in the report, but those of you who are unfamiliar with K-12, federal law requires that if students have an individualized education program, when they turn 16, the program has to include transition goals, which are college and career ready goals, and how they're going to achieve those goals. This is the biggest lever that we have on a student level to incorporate more college and high school programs. And Colorado's document specifically noted that and provided FAQ.
Moving on to our fifth category of unlocking potential is instructor capacity. In this particular area, states should develop strategies to support and allay concerns of instructors by encouraging collaboration between K-12 and post-secondary partners as college and high school programs are scaled, and in particular, connecting K-12 special education and higher education disability resource staff. Now, bigger picture, I know that instructor capacity is one of the biggest bottlenecks that it seems like we run into when we're working with college and high school programs, since you need the teachers to be able to provide college and high school courses. And the shortage of teachers qualified to teach college and high school courses is already, again, very acute, and proactively designing resources and training teachers to meet the needs of unique learners, specifically in this case, students with disabilities, will help expand access and success not only for students with disabilities, but also students everywhere, since so many of the practices that are beneficial to students with disabilities, things like providing social emotional supports, counseling, other forms of guidance, are directly beneficial to students from any background. So Karla, back to you.
Well, I wish I had more to offer in this one, but honestly, this, as you alluded to, it's a bottleneck in the movement as a whole, but this was probably the weakest area that we saw. In Arkansas, their concurrent enrollment policy specifies that the faculty guides include a policy for students with disabilities, which was a really nice first step. But we saw very few examples of this. And I think this is an easy one that states can begin to address if they're thoughtful. I mean, just having shared TA at the K-12 departments with the disability groups. But I can imagine for higher ed, this is daunting because they experience this less than we do on the K-12 side in terms of having students with disabilities in their classrooms. This is not really an example of a state, but probably the most important thing when you think of instructor capacity. So if you're not familiar, there's this thing called Universal Design for Learning, and they have an amazing website on CAST.org, C-A-S-T, and it's really the philosophy of how can we redesign learning environments so they work for all kids, which is really what John and I do at KnowledgeWorks all the time, by the way. But it's really these three buckets of ideas: is how can we provide multiple means for students to engage, multiple means for them to represent or show what they know, but also multiple means of how they express that, right? And so, I mean, it sounds silly, but we saw a lot of this during COVID, especially in higher ed, where things or accommodations that were something that students used to have to fight for, everybody got overnight because everybody had to go online and we're able to access recorded material and things like that. And so we're really hoping that a lot of those new modes and openness to them will continue past COVID.
Well, moving on to our final of our 6 categories, last but certainly not least, is navigational supports. And in this area, we want to highlight that states will prioritize the unique navigational supports and advising that students with disabilities need to ensure success in college and high school courses. Students in college and high school programs shouldn't be left to sink or swim on their own, just like you wouldn't do with any student, frankly, that is engaging in this type of coursework. All students are going to need some level of support to navigate transitions into these programs, since likely many students it will be their first time engaging with college level coursework. And because of that, programs must be intentional and thoughtful about ensuring that all students, especially students with disabilities, have access to the personalized supports that they need to maximize their success and ease the transition from secondary coursework into post-secondary learning environments.
Okay, so I'm not going to lie when I tell you that this is probably the North Star for advocates like me. Minnesota's law says, and I'm going to read it word for word because it's so incredibly powerful. The law actually says that if the student has an IEP that provides general education support and accommodations, the post-secondary education must provide the support services as described in the student's IEP. And the post-secondary institution, the district shall negotiate an agreement on the rate to be charged for the services. What I found in my research is that this is really interesting kind of debate. So in K-12, IDEA is the authorizing legislation federally. And as you guys know, in higher ed, it's ADA. So, but what I wanted to hopefully tease out of this report is let's take the conversation above what is just mere compliance and figure out how do we really support students so they can fully access and succeed college and high school programs. But there was also this idea in some states that higher ed doesn't need to do that. And that's true under federal law, but you can see from Minnesota that some states are coming out and saying, well, maybe you don't have to under federal law, but we think you should because we want students to succeed. Rhode Island, again, a very powerful example. Again, their law, and I'm really, really emphasizing the fact this is actually in statute, requires that students offering dual enrollment must adopt a statewide policy, which says that students with disabilities receive the protections, services, and accommodations as prescribed by federal and state law in accordance with policies and procedures, blah, blah, blah. But again, the law specifically saying that we can't just say, no, we can't. The question is how? In the federal spotlight. So again, remember I alluded to this thing called transition, which is a policy in federal law for students with disabilities. And the US Department of Ed every year updates their transition guide. And they have an entire section on dual enrollment. All right, so I'm gonna take a second and see if you guys have anything you want to throw in the chat, if any of these examples jumped out to you, or if you have any questions before we kind of wrap things up.
As folks are typing, I will just also add briefly, I'm just going to drop the link to the full roadmap into the chat in case you haven't had a chance to peruse it before. So feel free to access that if that is something you're interested in engaging with. And Karla, I believe you alluded to this, but the resource you put together, I believe is not currently up on College and High School Alliance's website, but will be posted very soon. So y'all are getting a teaser in a way of this great document that's about to come out.
All right, I'm going to go into the recommendations because as you can see, we covered a lot of ground in this report as well as in this presentation. So I wanted to kind of wrap all of this up into a little bow for you and kind of we distilled this into 3 overarching recommendations. Is one, have an inclusive vision, which means that regardless of what level you're at, if you're a state policymaker, a college administrator, a K-12 administrator, a teacher, review all of your policies related to college and high school programs and make sure that students with disabilities are intentionally and explicitly included. And I had some pretty good examples of that. And second, an explicit design. So design the programs as a strategy to improve outcomes with students with disabilities, which is different than saying we're going to design this to make sure our bases are covered and we're in compliance with the federal law. And last is supportive guidance. Is, have lots of field guidance out there because a lot of people have questions. Some people may be hesitant to even ask because they haven't worked in this space before. So you can have guidance for faculty, for the K-12 teachers, for administrators, even on the fiscal side, as we saw an example of too. Go ahead, Mary. Can we forward the slide? Uh-oh, are we stuck?
Yep, Karla, I think,
Oh.
did you miss the policy lever slide, which was the
I
previous one?
did. Oh yeah, we skipped one. Yeah, can we go back? There it is. That's the one I'm looking for. This slide is intentionally meant to recognize that we know any or all who are watching and listening now, or maybe in the future unrecorded, are in different places. As I said, you may be faculty, you may be administrator, or you may be a state policymaker. And so we think that the recommendations that we've made can apply to all of you if you think about it with different levers, right? If you're a policymaker, you may be able to enact law or enact regulations and rules. But at any level, you can do guidance documents and make sure that your memorandums of agreement reflect all of these principles. All right, so we want to kick it off to you guys. What is the one thing you think your state can do to improve dual and concurrent enrollment for students with disabilities? I see one comment in the chat that I'm really grateful for, that really flagging the term intentionally included. And I'll share with you even personally, I've been doing education policy for almost 25 years and just recently have kind of focused in on students with disabilities, partially because my daughter has one. But what I'm recognizing as I reflect back on my work was I always said things like, absolutely, all students should be included, right? All means all, not all, each and every. And we used to have these fun conversations like at conferences, but it's intentionally including. Like I say, even that Texas example, you can easily argue that those historically marginalized groups included students with disabilities, but it makes a big difference when the state agency says, oh, by the way, we really meant these students too. Can you forward to the last slide? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I was just thought I'd throw a couple out to you. So I'd be curious, what was the most surprising thing to you in the research that you did for this as you were digging into these state examples?
I'd say two things. One is the dearth of data, which, and John knows, I mean, behind the scenes, we had to contract to find this data because even through the lit review, we couldn't find any. But again, at that state level, even though it's required on so many levels, a lot of times students with disabilities were not disaggregated. So that was probably the most surprising, especially because, you know, we all know this. It's hard to develop policies and programs if we don't know the problem, if we can't define that scope. And I think the second thing that really surprised me and is keeping me kind of hooked in this conversation, in fact, I'm having conversations here locally, is that, I don't want to say controversy because that's probably too strong of a word, but the debate over the law. That, oh, well, colleges are ADA, so we don't have to worry about IEPs. And I met a woman in a different state who's actually suing, and her case is in front of, I think, the 6th Circuit Court, because her son was told that he has dual diagnosis of autism and he's also gifted. He was told that in order to access or enroll in a college and high school program in his state, that he had to let go of his IEP. So from the parent perspective, his mom, and I'm sure she's comfortable saying this because she's been very public about this story, her idea and mine going into this was that by definition, students enrolled in these programs are still K-12 students, right? Because the whole point of it is that they're going to get credit for both. So if they're still a K-12 student, their IEP must still apply. And I was really surprised to discover that a lot of people didn't think that.
And Karla, I know we only have a couple minutes left, but I'd also be curious, and on a positive note, what was the thing that gave you the most hope as you were doing this research and writing this report? Or left you in a good position, how good feelings?
No, thank you. It was the Minnesota and Rhode Island examples, because again, kind of through the research, I was getting a little discouraged going, why are we debating this law stuff? Again, my mentality always is that compliance is like the bottom line, the first step. We want kids to succeed, and let's elevate the conversation. So as I was getting depressed, then when I found Minnesota and Rhode Island, I'm like, okay, there are states, this is possible, because some folks were telling me, oh, that's not possible. And I'm like, no, it is. And hopefully we're elevating the conversation through this report. Here's our information, folks. Please engage with us, email, tweets. There's our Twitter's handles. We'd love to continue this conversation with you. We want to continue learning from states. So if there's anything that we didn't know about what's happening in North Carolina or whatever state you're in, if you're listening, please reach out to us, because I am fully intending on building this work out, as John knows, with follow-up blogs and other pieces. So as far as we know, this is the first report that's tried to look at this. If that's not true, please let us know as well. But that means that we're really at the cusp of this conversation. So help us with whatever you know. And thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. John, after you've heard me talk about this, and John and I have talked a lot about this over the past couple of months, and he was kind enough to be a constant reviewer and editor, so he knows a lot. What surprised you?
I mean, I think the thing that was most surprising to me, and I've been working in this space more at the 50,000 foot policy level for a few years now at the College and High School Alliance, both in my role at KnowledgeWorks and elsewhere. It was one of those moments where, when Karla started talking about some of the deficiencies around students' disabilities, realizing like, oh yeah, why is that? And we talk about all these other equity gaps and all of these other focus areas, and why has this never come up? And it's one of those things that as soon as someone points it out to you, and this seems very consistent actually across most of our conversations that we have with stakeholders, people say, oh yeah, we should be talking about that. And why aren't we talking about that? But until someone points it out, it just may be something that isn't at the top of people's minds, because there are so many things to focus on. So I would say, as an advocacy type of way, that from that feeling that I had, maybe one of the most powerful things that folks on this call can do is just really be very cognizant of when college and high school programs are being discussed, is just making sure, as I do now, since Karla has continually prodded me to do so, that students' disabilities are brought up in the conversations and not excluded from them in a very deliberate way.
Liking some of the comments I'm seeing. All right, well, I think that's all we have. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time this morning on a Friday morning. And we hope you all have